My name's Cameron McCormack. I work for Mozilla for the last 2 years. So I work mostly on platform Gecko stuff, so implementing some CSS features and some SVG ones as well. Also involved in some standards efforts, so I co-chair the SVG working group at the W3C, and some various other specs as well.
Hi, I'm Sylvia Pfeiffer. I currently contract to Google working on video stuff, video accessibility mostly. And I'm also a co-editor of the HTML spec at the W3C.
So hi, I'm Dirk Schulze. I'm working for Adobe, so web platform team at Adobe. I'm working on several specifications like filter effects, CSS transforms, CSS masking, and also SVG, and responsible for SVG implementation in WebKit.
I'm Jeremy Apthorpe. I'm working at Google on the Chrome team in Sydney. I'm working on apps and extensions.
My name is Ben Caro. I work for Mozilla. Moreover, I work in IT, and I'm also a general tech evangelist.
Hi, my name is Shane Stevens. I have been working for Google for about 5 years and Chrome for about 2.5. I'm also in the CSS and SVG working groups with Cameron, and do a bit of CSS work inside WebKit, and currently I've been doing a lot of animations work on a new web animation specification. So we've got a list of topics over here.
Do you want to use the room mic?
Yep. So we've got a list of topics over here. What I thought we could do is just vote on them as to which topics the audience is most interested in covering. I see a couple of people have added new topics down the bottom. If there's just no interest in any of these topics, then we can come up with new ones. But I mean, they're pretty general. I think we'll find something that most people are interested in. And we'll keep each topic to about 10 minutes and then move on to the next one. So we'll just do a show of hands. I'll read them all out and then we'll go back through. So this one says, YouTube developer Jeremy Kahn recently stated that he supports the WebKit monoculture. Is this a viable or desirable future for the web? The second one is, how relevant is the W3C? How relevant should it be? There have been heated discussions in the W3C HTML working group about whether to publish the encrypted media extension spec. Is this an appropriate technology to standardize at the W3C? Should browser vendors be allowed to innovate? What's the best way to get involved with browser development? Why is performance on the web so bad? Should we care about the web? People seem to like mobile apps better. Which responsive image specification do you prefer? And finally, is this semantic web actually attainable? So we'll just do a show of hands. You can vote as many times as you want. Who wants to talk about the WebKit monoculture? The relevance of the W3C? The encrypted media extensions specification. Should browser vendors be allowed to innovate?
No, they shouldn't.
No. What's the best way to get involved with browser development? Why is performance on the web so bad? Mm-hmm. Okay, this is a winner so far. Should we care about the web? People seem to like mobile apps better. Yeah. What responsive image spec do you prefer? And is the semantic web actually attainable? Okay, so it looked like we had most interest in why is performance on the web so bad, so we'll talk about that first. And this, and this were quite popular as well.
And the one above, number one. How to get involved.
The WebKit monoculture, can I have a show of hands for that again? What's the best way to get involved? How many were into that? No. It did seem to be more popular. Anyway, we'll do that if we have time. Yeah. Okay, so the topic is, why is performance on the web so bad? We've got 10 minutes and we'll take questions from the audience.
And if you can wait for me to get there with the microphone, we're recording this, otherwise we can't hear you on the audio. So the question we hand up, and I'll come to you.
So is the question, why is web performance so bad? I guess it's all our fault then. So I would question, I think maybe different areas of browsers might have different performance characteristics. Like JavaScript engines have come like leaps and bounds over the last 5 years or so. So I don't think there's like a performance problem there. Certain web features, I think, induce bad performance characteristics unless you implement them in a certain way. So I know that, for example, in Firefox's SVG filters implementation, currently they're all implemented as software filters. So basically, single thread, looping over pixels over a rendered part of the page and performing some color changing operations on them. So that's kind of slow when you get large areas that you want to apply filters to. So the solution to that is to try and do as much of that on the GPU as possible. So certain filters are pretty easy to write some shaders to implement, but we don't, in Gecko at the moment, we don't really have the underlying infrastructure to simply convert those to be implemented as shaders. There's a lot of work going on at the moment refactoring the layers, the layer tree. So we've heard about the layers architecture in WebKit a couple of times already this morning. So we've got some work at the moment trying to sort of refactor that, and that will allow us to implement some of these features like SVG filters, I don't know what else, opacity as, well, opacity already works actually. Well, SVG filters as shaders on the GPU, which should make them really smooth to scroll and not have to recompute pixel values every time you scroll a pixel down.
I don't think that filters are really the main issue of performance here. So I agree. So even our software rendering and SVG does use the same way to render, so it's very slow because it goes over pixel over each image. However, something that might be the truth is that, for instance, DOM access can be very slow, and this is one of the biggest performance issues. So if you have a lot of DOM access, then you will realize that this really slows down your performance. This is something that we realized at Adobe when we created a plugin that creates HTML content out of a Flash file. So if you have Flash animation and want to turn it into an HTML animation, one implementation did it by just recreating the elements all of the time, every frame, or at least change the DOM somehow in every frame. And this is extremely slow in all browsers, not just in Chrome or WebKit. It's a general problem. So what can you do about it? Try to avoid DOM access as much as possible. What can we do about it? Yeah, we still need to test the performance and why we actually have these problems and do more work. And this is a general problem because you can see it in all browsers, independent if it's Internet Explorer, Firefox, or WebKit. So we all have to do something on the DOM side.
So in my spare time, I like to write HTML5 games, and so a couple of the performance bottlenecks that I've really noticed. One of them is any sort of layout, although not really relevant to games, but like anything that has to reflow is obviously going to be really slow, and a lot of things sort of trigger a reflow even though they don't have to. There was an article recently about if you're animating the position of an element, you should use WebKit transform instead of position absolute and top 0 or like top and left, because changing the top and left causes a relayout, and it, in a lot of cases, doesn't need to. So we can do better figuring out when we need to relay out and when not. The other thing that I found to be a huge issue is garbage collection in JavaScript engines is too hard to control. So you end up with trying to write a 60 frames per second game, and in the middle of one of your frames, V8 decides it's time to collect garbage and just skips 2 or 3 frames, and you have no real control over that. And it's really hard in JavaScript to write code that doesn't leave any garbage. It's quite unnatural. So we need to maybe come up with better libraries, or I saw something recently called LLJS, which is like a low-level compiles to JavaScript thing that alleviates this a little bit. Kind of looks more like C, unless you do manual memory management, but it's still in its infancy and there's still really no tools. It's even hard to figure out what's going on when it garbage collects. When you open the Chrome like heap profiler and you say profile heap, it collects all the garbage. And so you can't see what am I doing in my code that's creating this garbage. So we need better tooling, I think, and better control over GC in JavaScript.
The microphone over here. Okay, I kind of have my answer stolen from me already because everyone's iterated everything I was going to mention. Like garbage collection has been a huge issue, at least from a user point of view who has a little bit of insight into the internals. I can see how the garbage collector is kind of ruining my performance at, I mean, once you know it's there and you know what it does, and it's really easy to see when it affects the behavior of your performance. Beyond that, I think that like resource caching, like uncompressed images for off-screen rendering, things like that, have gotten a lot of improvement in the past year or so, but it's still kind of a problem in terms of memory usage. That's about it.
Does anyone have any questions from the audience about specific aspects of performance? Yep.
I noticed recently that both WebKit and Gecko in the last year or so had really improved the performance of the Canvas implementation for at least 2D draw operations. Not pixel operations, but like drawing lines and shapes and that kind of stuff. Can you talk a little bit about how you implemented those changes?
Did any of us implement those changes?
So I don't work on the Canvas implementation, so I'm not exactly sure. But I do know that part of what has made Canvas faster recently is improvements to our bindings layer, which is the overhead from JavaScript calling the function in to get it into the C++, which actually does the drawing operation. And I'll talk a bit about that like in the next session, actually. So that's, I think, part of the reason why it's become faster. I'm not sure what other optimizations or improvements they've done to the actual drawing code, though.
I know that for a long time, Internet Explorer actually had the fastest Canvas implementation of any browser, and that's because they actually did a lot of the work on the GPU. So without knowing anything specifically about what we do in WebKit or what Gecko does, I would imagine that we're offloading some of the work, at least some of the work, to the GPU. And that's part of the reason for the performance improvement.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. And another part is that even the graphic libraries improve every year. So Skier is hardware isolated now. Core graphics is a lot better hardware isolated than it was before. So you see a big jump in performance, even in SVG, when you look or compare Safari 4 to Safari 5. And that's not because of the WebKit code, it's really just because of the core animation code. And everything gets more performant over time, not only browsers.
We just roll the depths.
Can I comment about that decision? Yes, I'm from company 100, Hwang Yun-hwang. Actually, we implemented Canvas GL to draw hardware accelerate, open GPU accelerated Canvas to the implementation. As Dirk says, there are so many backends to draw HTML5 to the canvas. In the GTK, they use Cairo. And in the Cairo, they implemented Cairo GL or Cairo GLES to use the OpenGL directly to draw something vector graphics like drawing lines or fill act and etc. And Skia, yes, Skia also used what's that? Ganesh, yes. Skia used the GPU to accelerate its 2D vector graphics operations, so it is applied on the maybe Jelly Bean. Yes, Android. It is also applied on the Jelly Bean, Android, and Google Chromium. And yes, Dirk says yes, core graphics also applied. Is it Quartz 2D, right?
Sorry?
Is it Quartz 2D, right? To draw vector graphics?
Graphics, I guess. I think it's core graphics.
Yeah, core graphics. So it is almost of the Canvas HTML5 to the Canvas APIs are mapped to graphics context in the WebKit case. So it directly uses the 2D graphics. So if we remove the abstraction layer between the 2D graphics to OpenGL drivers, so we can optimize huge performance optimization, but it's still, it is a little bit harder because there are so many combinations on the 2D drawing vector graphics API, so we cannot optimize all the systems. So it is a big part to optimization. Yeah.
I've actually just remembered part of the reason why our canvases got faster. So one of the graphics bottlenecks that we have had in the past, and still do have to some degree, is that we are using Cairo as our sort of abstract graphics interface, and underneath that maps to OpenGL or doing software or whatever. And there's a bit of a mismatch between some backends and the way the Cairo API is designed. So, for example, Direct2D on Windows is quite stateless, I think. So every time you do a drawing operation, you specify the fill color, the stroke dashing style, blah, 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 rather than, say, setting on the context, well, for now until indefinitely in the future, use this fill color, use this stroke style, which is the way that the Cairo API works. So whenever we had to do calls through Cairo, we would have to do some additional work to convert between like stateful and stateless APIs. So we have a new intermediate graphics layer that's been developed called Azure, and that's a stateless one, which maps better to certain hardware accelerated APIs like Direct2D. So I think that Canvas got switched over to using Azure instead of poking Cairo calls directly. So I think that's where part of the other improvements has come from.
Yeah, in regards to Cairo, one of the performance increases from there was we were able to turn on hardware acceleration, turn on OpenGL rendering instead of software rendering, just because drivers improved, especially like the Intel Linux drivers.
I think that might be all we have time for on that topic, unless we could take one more question if there's, yep.
On the network layer, how much effect do you think like Speedy will actually improve performance for the end user?
So I know a lot of things that Speedy does are particularly good on mobile, where latency is high. Even though bandwidth can be pretty big, and so it can do things like packing resources into the initial page requests to avoid round trips. So that's going to have a big impact, I believe.
I think it's this general issue that as more files you have, as more requests you have to the server, and that's the bottleneck nowadays. So that's why a lot of developers pack everything together in one package, in one JavaScript file, in one CSS file, so that the requests get lower, and this is a huge performance impact as well. Another part is, for instance, image sprites, that you use different images, pack it together to one image, so that you also remove the different requests and just have one request and get a lot of images at once.
Okay.
Sure. Okay.
All right. Well, let's talk about the W3C. How relevant is the W3C, and how relevant should it be? I'd really like to get some audience questions, but maybe we can start. How many people think that they're, reasonably aware of what the W3C does? Somewhat, maybe. Okay, so I guess that would start to answer the question that maybe it's not so relevant.
How about a comparison between, what W3C does and, looking at this morning's comments about standards bodies in general?
Sorry, I'm supposed to come up and bring this back.
How well do you think the W3C is performing as a standards body?
So we heard the stories this morning, right? Yeah. As she was telling the stories, I was just laughing to myself because I've seen it happen in many different standards bodies. Like IETF is doing it slightly differently, but in the end, like the same kind of thing. W3C again, like it's just the way it goes when you bring a lot of individuals together with different backgrounds, all trying to get the same technology. There's the same problems resolved around one specific specification that everyone then has to go off and implement in their technologies. So there's so many interests there, and there's political issues there as well, other than just personal issues and knowledge issues. It always ends up looking fairly similar. So yeah, W3C I wouldn't think is that different from the networking standards. Yeah.
I think we can take comfort from the idea that it could be worse.
Yeah.
Not very much, but it could be.
Well, we're still getting specs out. That's a good thing. And in fact, the web's been moving really fast recently, so which is great. I mean, that's actually really a big task that Ian has achieved there with the WOT working group, and deliberately breaking with where the W3C was going with HTML. Has really put HTML back on the map, and browsers have totally followed it and are embracing it. And the W3C has then stepped in and said, "Yes, okay, we'll do this as well because you're obviously doing the right thing." We see that we were, doing the wrong thing, yeah, it's moving forward.
So something that we should not forget is that a lot of editors of specifications are also implementers, and because the web moves forward so fast, the resources are going into the implementations and not so much into specifications, which slow down the specification a bit. It's a general issue, but So when you mentioned WOT working group. Something that is good about it is that the standard is moving really fast, but you're in the HTML working group for the WCC, and the good thing on the WCC is that we have a release specifications that you can rely on. So it's nice to have a live specification that moves on statically and all the time, a really dynamic specification. But at some point, you also need a fallback, I would call fallback, where you say, okay, this is something that you can rely on, this is something that will stay.
Maybe
Questions?
if I can add there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think what we're seeing with the HTML specification is just mirroring general software development, the way that software development's been going in the past. You have all this work happening on a piece of software, and eventually there's a release, right? And so you release it, and that's a set of fixed features that might still have bugs. So you fix those bugs, and eventually that thing gets replaced by the next release, which comes out and gets new bug fixes and so on. And I think we're starting to go towards that model at the W3C. We've just released 5.0 as a CR. What's that called again? It's not committee. It's candidate. Thank you. Candidate recommendation, which means that we've said there won't be any new features going into this. This is the amount of features that we've put into this HTML specification. What we're doing with this specification is now giving it a reality check. We're doing all the tests. So there's a huge test suite being developed. And we're testing that across all the browsers, only if we can find the features that are compatibly implemented with at least 2 browsers, I think. Or is it 3? 2? 2.
It depends on the working group, but normally 2.
Yeah, 2. We leave it in. If we can't find any compatible implementations, we drop it out of HTML 5.0. But HTML 5.1 still has all these potential new features in it that we encourage browsers to implement. So by the time that we move HTML 5.1 into candidate recommendation, there'll be new features in there, and it'll be the next version. So it's more like a software project release cycle that we're going through now, and hopefully also the cycles will get shorter. We won't, need to wait for 6 years before we get another spec.
I was just going to say, I think the living HTML spec is maybe an elaborate ruse by Hixie to try and get Internet Explorer to release more than once a decade.
Questions, comments, heckles? Some of us are actually on W3C committees, so you could heckle us.
I think in terms of how well working groups work together at the W3C, or within a single group, varies quite a bit because the actual work modes between the different groups is pretty different. Like the HTML working group has 1 billion members ostensibly, at least on the mailing list, but there are really only a couple of people who do the actual real work. And there's, of course, you have that coordination with the WOT WG spec as well. The SVG working group is kind of small. There's only like maybe 7 or 8 active people there, and we all get on pretty well. So, apart from this guy who's a bit of a troublemaker, we don't really have like fights or anything. And the web applications working group is kind of almost like a dumping ground. There's probably like 20 different active specifications going on where there's like one editor from some organisation and a few people commenting on it, and largely they sort of operate independently but just happen to use the same mailing list.
Okay, I'll ask a question then. Is it relevant though? Could we be doing this without a W3C style organisation, just as individual browsers coming up with innovations and then sharing those which look good?
I think we all saw how that worked in the 90s. Like.
So is the environment now the same as in the 90s? I mean, we had a monoculture in the 90s, didn't we?
I think what we still need in any case is a forum where the browsers can come together, and that needs to be something at least somewhat public. Like that's my biggest concern about the WebKit monoculture in point 1. That question that we were not going to talk about.
No, it's started. We can.
Of sorts, yes. So we could, get rid of all rendering engines on the planet and just use WebKit as a rendering engine in all browsers, and all browsers would, use the same web core stuff. That would resolve a lot of differences in implementation. If we had only one, of course, they would all be compatible. But then the W3C becomes sort of irrelevant, because why would they write anything for multiple companies when there's this one organization that does it all? So, but then the discussions would move from the W3C into a WebKit organization, and WebKit would need to, the WebKit mailing list turns into the one where the standards get developed. Because then there would be many browser vendors be subscribed to that list, and they would need to agree on which features go in. So I don't know, at some point you have to work together. So the W3C is just providing that organization where you can work together right now. It's by far also not the only organization where discussions happen, where decisions are made, but somewhere it's got to be open, and in particular the specs need to be open. I don't think that it's possible to totally replace, totally get rid of such an organization.
I think if it disappeared, then a venue would be created. Something would pop up.
So something that we should not forget about it is that all specifications are royalty free, and all companies in the WCC accepting a specification need to give their patents on it. So this is also a legal question, not only a question of work. So that means everything, you can use HTML where you want to, and you can nearly be safe that no one will actually sue you. Yeah, exactly. And that's something that you definitely need, independent where you actually work. The specifications are.
All right. No more questions or comments on that topic? Okay. The encrypted media extensions specification. Should we be looking at this sort of thing on the W3C or not?
So maybe you can summarize what this is.
Summarize what it is. So a bunch of people in the HTML working group have about a year ago, I think, proposed to implement and to standardize an API through which you can interact with DRM style libraries on the operating system that are implemented, so that people can actually watch, encrypted video in particular through their web browsers. Because right now we don't have that kind of support in web browsers. You have to go back to Flash to get that kind of support. So there was a big outcry. People didn't want DRM stuff in the browser, even though it would just be an API. So these people have gone away from the mailing list, created a sub-mailing list, a subgroup, and come up with a spec, which I think is also a little bit implemented already.
Oh,
no?
I don't know.
I don't know. Anyway, there's a spec which has been developed by multiple organizations. There's Adobe is involved, I think. Netflix, lots of the movie studios have an interest. So a lot of these companies that publish this kind of data that want it on the web have got involved. And Google, of course, is there as well, and have developed a spec. And that's been developed as an extension specification for the HTML specification and now just brought back into the HTML, public HTML list in the HTML working group as a proposal to be actually published as a extension specification. The discussion is about whether this is just bringing in DRM through the back door into the browsers, or whether it also has other functionalities, such as securing, for example, peer-to-peer connections from being eavesdropped on and stuff like that. So, I don't know if
it's kind of a tough thing because so companies already publish their content like Netflix through a plugin, and it's either going to be, most of the time it's Flash, and some of them might use Silverlight if you happen to have that installed. So they're already publishing DRM protected content, and I think everybody agrees that getting rid of plugins in web content is a good idea, and that's kind of like, well, we've already solved the problem of publishing video because now we have video elements in HTML5, but this encrypted video, protected video, is something that you can't do with HTML. So I think that's the standpoint they're coming from,
yeah,
which is why they want this feature. But what it means is that realistically, you couldn't implement this on Firefox for Linux because, firstly, the platform APIs to actually do the DRM decryption aren't there because there's some Windows Clear Play or whatever it's called versus, and there are a few different ones of them, which aren't available on Linux, of course. So basically, you're locking out all of this Linux audience who, at the moment, could actually watch it because they can use the current like Netflix viewer with Flash plugin. So it's understandable that these people want to be able to still be able to publish their content in a future where we don't have browser plugins, but it's also going to have a sort of detrimental effect to like purely free implementations. So I'm not really sure where the answer is.
Yeah, I'd actually be curious about opinions from the audience. If anyone has any opinions, questions.
So just excuse me if I misunderstand what it's about, but I have a question as to how running over HTTPS doesn't secure that, and that you can't secure, I mean, it's an application or a web page that a company's providing. How is it that them controlling a session or a logon and then providing the media over HTTPS doesn't cover the encryption and the security of it? Am I misunderstanding why they want an encrypted DRM for the media?
I think the data stream going from their servers through your browser doesn't get decrypted by the browser, but is instead passed to your platform somewhere where it's rendered by something else, not your browser.
Presumably so that you can't screen grab it.
It's also the video element in HTML5. The video element in HTML5, you can right now in almost every browser right-click and save as, and they basically want to avoid that.
And it'll rickroll you.
And sorry?
Then it rickrolls you, right?
On YouTube. That was YouTube, and they've removed that functionality.
So, I mean, the one problem is, of course, that if you're doing that with HTML5 video, then you immediately lock out, or you have to lock out access to a whole bunch of the APIs associated with video, like the ability to take images out of it and to manipulate the audio and to pass it into various, data streams or whatever else it is that you're doing, like media streams or whatever.
Not necessary, it depends on the implementation. However, one problem is that's something that Cameron mentions. The question is how it is implemented, how is it specified. So right now it's a model of trust, and the question is, how does the server know if you can trust the browser or not? How is that working? And that's something that is critical, and that's the part that's now discussed. Because how do we know if an open source browser will be a trustable browser for DRM? That needs some kind of an API, it needs some kind of a specification that works for all.
I mean, anytime there's debugging tools, you can theoretically get into the browser and potentially extract the image content, though, right? I mean, is that going to be something that's going to have to be locked down as well?
With open source.
But I mean, even with a closed source browser, potentially, if you can get a web debugger in there, there might be a way of extracting the content if you can inject JavaScript or something into the page.
I think ultimately it's kind of, at some level, it's about raising the bar rather than making it completely impossible. If you took that sort of to its logical conclusion, you could say, well, I can just plug in a VGA device on the output and then record it that way, or DVI. And HDMI tries to get around this by being encrypted over the wire as it goes from your device to the screen. But even then, you could theoretically get your hands on HDMI encryption keys and decrypt it at that point. So it's not really about making it impossible to do this. It's about making it difficult, I think.
That's absolutely what it is. They want to make it as difficult as possible. And the point is also that it's going to use whatever encryption you've already installed on your machine to decrypt, and which you have established a trust relationship with the content provider by installing this thing. So you have some sort of key or something, and that's just getting used by the browser for displaying the content. It's not even about the mechanism of DRM itself. It's just about an API towards it, to getting at the data. And yes, there are all sorts of issues about once we have the data, how much do we allow users to do with it? Do we actually get the pixel data into the browser, or do we just provide a rendering area that some other thing from underneath will render into, so the browser has actually nothing to do with it? You get into, you replace the Flash plugin infrastructure with a completely different plugin infrastructure on a different level. So from some point of view, you're just exchanging one plugin infrastructure with another, and that's one of the big objections towards it, because not the whole thing is standardized, just towards the API towards such a key mechanism. So there's no standardization of the key mechanism itself, not even a simple one, and clear key, of course, is basically no key infrastructure, so that's a clear key is specified. I don't know. I almost think that before we have an implementation and somebody actually shows how this is going to work, it's almost impossible to say whether it's a good or a bad thing.
So the problem you're having, though, is open source is fundamentally incompatible with DRM, because the open source idea is that the user has control over their platform and the ability to do anything with their platform, and the copyright content provider doesn't want that. So how can you build a trust mechanism when the person has complete control over their system? You can't, because anything can be faked. So the only way to build this system is to have a part which you don't control, which is something that the open source world is trying to remove, because that's like the whole point of this, that the user has control. And what partly Bidal was talking about on Monday is that it's all about, it's not necessarily about, communism or any of those type of things. It's about giving the user control, and that is fundamentally incompatible with the idea that you can trust them, because the only thing you can do is say, okay, I trust you not to be bad, right? You can't actually prevent that using technology.
Yeah, it's a good point.
More questions? Okay, just quickly, I think we have time for one more topic. Should it be, what's the best way to get involved with browser development? Should it be, should we care about the web? People seem to like mobile apps better. Or should it be, what responsive image spec do you prefer? Wow.
That's a quick show of hands.
How about they just ask general questions?
Yeah, it could just be general questions.
With Firefox OS on the horizon, I think the one about mobile versus web would be an interesting topic to talk about.
Mobile OSs? Okay. Do you have a question?
I don't know, is this, I guess, Firefox OS, is it going to be a game changer? I guess, tell us more.
Yeah, we like to think so. I guess I could put on my little evangelist hat and say that right now with Android and iOS, they're really kind of closed silo platforms, and all for developers to develop for it, they either have to learn Java in a horrific SDK or they have to learn Objective-C in a horrific SDK when they already know these general web technologies. So why not use those developers that you already have to create the next mobile platform?
I actually just have one question. So does Firefox OS support proprietary formats, like video formats that?
Yes. What it does is if it detects hardware acceleration for certain media formats like H.264, it will pass the video stream through to the hardware decoder. That's the, I don't know, the accommodation that we made for it.
Okay, so we're taking general questions, so stick your hand up if you have a question.
I'd like to continue on the mobile theme since the previous asked about it. So everything you seem to describe with Firefox OS already exists in the form of WebOS. I mean, it's the same type of idea that you have a WebKit-based system. WebOS is kind of dead.
Yes.
What makes Firefox OS unique compared to like WebOS that is going to make it successful where WebOS failed?
So I actually have an HP touchpad at home, and I tried to play with WebOS before and after they were on fire sale. And they had a real problem creating a value proposition for both the user and the developer. If you ever tried to develop for it, they didn't really have very good developer tools. They didn't have an SDK at all, really. And additionally, they didn't have any way to get to any of the device specifics. So if you were going to make an application, you didn't, for instance, have access to the wireless. You didn't have access to the battery life. You didn't even have a security model in it. And those are just three of the things that we've added with the W3C and other standards bodies to try to get Firefox OS to be able to jump past where WebOS ended.
My question's with relation to security. I think Google announced today that they're now funding Pi, as in $3.14 million for the next Podium Awards. And there have been some really significant winners of that previously, not too long ago either. Basically, Google seemed to find the lion's share of all of the really serious bugs in WebKit, and then eventually they trickle down and months later show up in Safari and get patched that way. Given that the browser is basically the point at which a lot of evil on the internet hits the user, and that if things aren't done quite well there, or particularly if vulnerabilities aren't squashed quickly or prevented from happening in the first place, then bad things happen to a lot of people. I mean, how do you make sure that you integrate? I mean, how do you compete with Google to make sure that you do as much as you possibly can to encourage people to notify you of any kind of security-related bug and like seriously reward them in the process, which then adds value and stability and trustworthiness to your product?
I guess there's a difference between rewarding and seriously rewarding. I mean, so Mozilla does pay out bounties for security bugs that are reported, but they're probably not as much as what Google would pay if you find a bug in Chrome or in WebKit. I'm not really sure what other mechanisms you could use to encourage people to spend some time searching for vulnerabilities in our code. Paying money, I think, is a pretty reasonable incentive to do that. What other things could you offer people to encourage them to do that sort of thing? Fame? Well, that's not a bad idea, actually. Yeah. Do you want a Mozilla phone?
Yeah, I should note that it's on all browser levels, and our bug bounties on browser levels and all websites. So get cracking. Let us improve our security.
I think I read a very good article lately about the security model of HTML and why HTML should not be used just because of all the security issues. The good thing is that HTML and all this, all browsers or most browsers are developed publicly. Everything is quite transparent, and this makes it more secure than anything else that we have on the planet. on software at least. And therefore, I think security with the web is very serious and is actually one of the most secure part in the software business at the moment.
We have time for just one more question.
What's the best way for me to report a browser bug? Or probably better, what makes a good bug report?
I'm not sure if you are in Sydney on Friday next week, because then we have the test report event, and one talk is about exactly this topic, if I'm right, currently.
One of the best ways that you can get your bug looked at is to provide a reduced test case, actually. If you can provide like 3-line HTML file that exhibits the bug that you have, it's so much easier for us to find and fix the bug. So that's one, like, when triaging, if there's a reduced test case, it's easy to file, it's easy to verify that the bug is there, and it's easy to find who should be responsible for it. So reduced test case, #1 way to make your bug get fixed.
Yeah, I would agree. I think verification is like the first step that you would take in terms of somebody has reported a bug, now what do we do with it? If we can't reproduce the bug, then it's fairly unlikely we'd be able to fix it. I mean, sometimes you can guess what the problem is and you can maybe do some code inspection, but yeah, if you can provide reduced test case and steps to reproduce, I think that's what you need to do. Yeah.
Another part is you often need to be patient and responsible. It's also
Responsive?
not required.
Responsive.
Yeah, not required, but at least it would be really great to fix the bug.
Okay, that's all we have time for. Please join me in thanking our panel.